Hi, everybody, and welcome to the morning meeting. I'm your host, Julio Briones, and today we're going to talk about a topic that tends to get people in a lot of trouble, and sadly, a lot of home care agency owners tend to ignore. And that topic is our employee handbook. So, the people that work in franchising or that open up through their franchise, they come in, they usually get a bunch of templates and everything else, but one of the general rules is that they have to go and get the employee handbook made themselves. Many times they will, most times they will because it's state regulation, sometimes they ignore it. And this is especially true when we're talking about independent home care agency owners. We tend to ignore the risks, we tend to ignore the benefits. And now I'm no expert. So what we've done is we've got the privilege of having Anne-Lise Gere of Gere Consulting, and she's going to talk to us all about the employee handbook. So thanks for coming on, Anne.
Well, Julio, thank you for having me. It's nice to meet your audience today. And I actually was doing a handbook training to employees last week because my client we had worked long and hard on updating their existing handbook. And I started my training in front of 25 people saying, who is excited to talk about employee handbook today? And I could see some, I could see some smiles and people like, oh, and I'm like, I know, yeah, the true answer is nobody's excited to talk about employee handbook until something goes wrong. And here's a little tidbit for your audience, especially those of you who are agency owners or who manage people. If somebody asks you, where can I find a copy of the employee handbook? I remember I had to sign it when I first joined the organization, but I just can't find it. That's very often a pretty sure thing that they're not happy about something, and they are looking at the policies to see what the policy says to compare with how they've been handled, managed by the organization. And if they're not happy, be able to say, hey, guess what I found? Or they're comparing your policies with their next employer, and they're trying to figure out, on balance, which one is best, the devil I know or the one I don't.
So basically just take it as a red flag.
Absolutely. That's the word, a red flag.
Awesome.
So that, that's sort of, tongue in cheek. We're joking about it, but in the current context of the Great Resignation, most employers, especially small employers, small and mid-sized employers, cannot afford to lose their staff, and in particular, their office staff. We know that caregiver retention is bad. There's high turnover. There's always been high turnover in the caregiving workforce.
Right.
It's become, 65% is what Homecare Pulse is telling us is the national average. So that's enormous. I could talk about it for several hours, but that's not our topic for today. But when we look at, why it matters is that a lot of the handbooks rules, you may want to have actually in home care, you may want to have two different manuals or some policies that will be for office-based employees and some policies that are going to be for field-based employees because the reality of their work is different.
That's actually a very interesting point. And back before I was doing the consulting, when I used to work with a franchise company, that was our policy or our recommendation when dealing with new franchisees. We used to always recommend the in-office have one set and the field, because the rules are different, the expectations are different.
Right. And some policies will apply to field-based employees, such as accepting gifts.
Right.
But is not so relevant I mean, you could argue that sometimes it is with office staff.
Right.
So that's just a small example, but and then it comes down to a practicality. I'm always one that encourages openness and transparency. So the reason why you would want to do two different manuals is not because you want to hide the policies that apply to one group from the other group, but just because you're trying to be, targeted and sort of showing to that one employee population, in particular the field-based workers, what the policies that apply specifically to them. I have a client in Michigan. She has a large agency, 350 field workers, direct care workers, 50 or so, maybe a little less, 35 office employees. She decided to do one book. And so some policies are office staff only, field, caregiver, caregiving professionals only. And, if it's not specified, it applies to both. It's totally a sort of it's a cultural and management choice, really, what they want to do. But maybe before we get down that rabbit hole, why do you even want to have a handbook? I think we haven't addressed that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would guess it's some of the points that you already mentioned, the transparency and everything, but wouldn't it also provide some sort of like legal protection for the business?
It can, although it can also work against you. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. The first thing is it's a management tool of communication. So you're communicating the rules, and it is in writing, so everybody can see it. It's written the same way, and you don't rely on word of mouth, right? Or people's memory of a rule or a procedure. So that's the first thing. I'm sorry, you mention something. I was going to address that. What was that?
Oh, about the legal protection or legal
protection. So yes, so everything that is in writing will always prevail if there is a question. So where sometimes it can work against you, and I've seen it, is something is written black and white, literally, in your handbook, and the business owner will have very different practices than the policies that they have, just because they don't remember that we had written a policy about that. And so should that ever come into court, that discrepancy about what you say you're going to do in your handbook and what actually happens can be used against you. And so that's where, that's why some of my employers are reluctant to put things in writing, because then they're going to be held to it. And I've had some long and hard conversations with some of them. And, it is it comes down to a management choice, right? Each business owner is ultimately in charge and responsible for their business. So,
So then, I mean, it sounds to me like probably a good takeaway, or for good first takeaway from this conversation will probably be, just going out on a limb, don't buy one just pre-made, and hope for the best. I see that.
That's very true, Julio, especially if you are in a state like yours in New Jersey, that has a lot of state-specific employment laws. And even more specifically, because I have one of my longest and largest client who is based in New Jersey. I will not pretend to know New Jersey employment law very well, but I've been around it long enough to know that they have New Jersey specific laws, and they have healthcare New Jersey specific laws. So it gets to be extremely specialized. There are a lot of attorneys in New Jersey, New York, and one of the reasons is because the laws are complicated, right? And so if you're buying a handbook already written, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad one, just make sure that it meets your state requirements. And the other thing is, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you probably could have flown reasonably well with sort of a generic sort of, bland, American sort of federal law type handbook. The problem is in the last 15 years since then, some states have become very activist on the employment law front.
Oh,
Massachusetts, California, it's almost like doing HR in a different country, to be honest with you. I don't do California HR because it is so very different.
yeah.
New York, New Jersey, Connecticut is starting to go down that path.
Right.
Where it's constantly evolving. I mean, I had a client in New York, around New York City, and I had to throw the towel with him a few years ago when they kept adding new paid sick laws, and you had the state one, then you had the Winchester County one, and then you had New York City one. And I was like, Glenn, this is getting to be way too complicated. You actually need an attorney to write that policy for you, because I mean, I can read the text, I can interpret the text, but sometimes when there are some subtlety, nuances, or even conflicts, I don't know how to resolve that.
I'm not an HR person. I'm more, operations type. But I got to tell you, I have a client out in Great Neck, New York, and they run into all sorts of problems all the time because you have Long Island, Nassau County, Suffolk County, and then the 5 boroughs, because employees come from all those places. His employee manual is a nightmare. I flipped through it one time. I'm like, wow, you must have paid a lot of money for this, because he had to
and
hire
honestly,
an attorney.
That becomes so complicated that even for employees, it's hard to sort of wait. But what the governing law is, the law of where the work takes place.
Right.
So if you are located in Pennsylvania and you're servicing client just across the border from Philly in New Jersey, those that work in New Jersey, you have to follow New Jersey employment law.
Yes.
Same with taxes, right? It's where the work happens. You have to pay
the controlling
taxes.
state. It's definitely something that I don't envy you. I don't envy you in some of these states.
I do other things than employee handbooks. I do a few, but it's it's not my only thing that I do. So I mean, hopefully these few points that we're bringing up here, just sort of talking, will convince your audience that if they don't have an employee handbook, or if they haven't looked at it in a few years, that it's time to probably put it on the project list for the next 6 months. Yeah,
I would imagine treating an employee handbook would be similar in nature to your operational practices or your policy and procedures for internal operations, where you want to review it yearly, just even if it's a glance over, just to kind of go over it and just understand what your expectations are, and so that your staff understands what they are and if anything has changed.
So it would be ideal. I have one client, she is religious about looking at our employee handbook every summer. But she is not in healthcare. She has a private school, and so the summer is kind of their quiet time, where they have downtime to be able to sort of plan for the next school year. Anyway, that's kind of the exception. If all employees were doing that, that'd be fantastic. The reality is, from my experience, that every 2 to 3 years you should really do a thorough look at. And then if you know that the laws are changing significantly, and especially when it comes to pay, paid leave, drug testing, background checks, these things are in flux, and they change differently in different states. So even if you're a single state employer, make sure that you know what's happened. And if there's something you've just heard it on the news, it's going to be significant, and then go back and ask a professional, whether it's an HR consultant or even an attorney, to kind of look at that one specific policy. They may not need to do a full up review. They may try to convince you that you need to do it, and maybe you do, I don't know, but at least look at that one specific policy would be one way to approach it in a sort of easier, because it gives people headaches to just think about their employee handbooks. I know it. I get it.
Yeah. So, I mean, what would you say if somebody was just, let's say, starting their home care agency and they're trying to muddle through this on their own? What would you say would be the number one tip, I guess, besides, see, my number one tip would be go hire you. What would be the number one tip if somebody really insisted on trying to figure this out on their own?
Well,
Besides being very brave to do that, but
it has been done before.
Yeah.
If you know if you know somebody who has had a good handbook in your industry, in your state, and they're willing to share it with you, maybe you can sort of reapply that. But it would have to be a really good friend, because they have probably paid good money for that, and to give it away for free would be tough.
Okay.
The other thing, it really depends on how big your organization is.
Right.
Because if you have less than 25 employees, none of the federal laws, and I think, and I'm going out on a limb because of course each state can be different, but most laws do not require you to publish or communicate something if you are less than 25 employees.
Correct.
Once you get to 25, 50, that's when you start. So, if you have an agency and you're not starting at 25, you're starting with an owner, maybe somebody in the office who does everything else that the owner doesn't do, and a handful of caregivers, right? That's sort of how it works typically.
Right.
So you don't need to worry too much about an employee handbook at that point. Once you get to 25 and then 50, at 50, you've got the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, that starts kicking in. You have other legal requirements where there is a requirement to communicate the laws to your employees. And so you could have a poster, one of these Department of Labor posters, they're good ones. But you can also, that's when starting an employee handbook sort of becomes almost a necessity.
I mean, it wasn't to put you on the spot. It's just that, like I said, a lot of times I run into people at different stages. I get calls from people starting out. I get calls from, and sometimes, I get asked those questions like, well, I was going to
continue on and say a few things. What are the things that employees regularly have questions about?
Right.
And I'm thinking here more office staff than caregivers. Office staffs tend to be maybe exempt employees, management professional. But anyway, when you work in an office, there's an expectation that you're going to have some sort of paid holidays, right? So as a business, what are your paid holidays? Do you decide that, let's say, 4th of July falls on a Sunday? Are you going to observe that holiday the following Monday? Or you're just going to say, well, sorry, this year, you're not getting a paid holiday because the calendar, and that is totally a management decision. There's no legal requirement to do it one way or the other. And by the way, you don't even have to, at least in most states that I know, even provide paid holidays. But if you want to be an employer that is somewhat attractive, you're going to have, 5, 6, 7 different holidays. Same with paid time off. Some states now mandate some sort of family medical leave or personal sick leave. So you're going to have to sort of figure it out how you're going to implement that in your organization. If you don't have a legal requirement for paid time off, then you probably want to institute something. The norm in the United States is to give people 2 weeks of PTO they can use for sick, but if you don't have paid sick leave in your state, and they can use it for personal time off, which we all need a break to refresh, recuperate, and we also all have a life outside of work, and sometimes we need to take a day off to take care of stuff. And so those are some holidays, time off. Then another one which is important more from a risk management as a business owner, make sure that your employees are properly classified. And I don't want to sound too sort of HR technical here, but you have basically 3 different classifications. You are exempt, so you're a professional employee who is paid a salary and you don't get paid overtime. You can be a non-exempt employee, and so you get paid overtime, but you customarily work around 40 hours a week.
Right.
And the week, and then you can make up the time you don't take with PTO. And then you've got typically your direct care workers that are hourly, and they only get paid when they work, right?
Right.
And so making sure that you are clear in your mind who is our exempt and non-exempt, it's really important because it impacts how you pay people.
Right.
And oh, by the way, if you're not sure who's exempt and non-exempt, then the default is everybody is non-exempt,
Yes.
which is a double negative. So I'm sorry, it's the Department of Labor language here, not mine, which means that everybody becomes eligible for overtime.
Yeah.
And that's fine. You're not going to get in trouble with Department of Labor for classifying everybody as non-exempt. Right. The downside, of course, is it could start being expensive because you have to pay overtime every time somebody works more than 40 hours a week. So again, that's a management decision. What is the culture in your organization? Do people really work crazy hours, or do people tend to work pretty much a standard, 8 to 5 with an hour lunch, day in and day out, and 40 hours in a week?
Right.
So that's
so when in doubt,
those are some of the things that people will have questions about, and so you need to have thought about it and putting it in writing. And so by doing that, you're starting to create the nucleus of an employee handbook.
Okay. All right. I mean, my recommendation is always go get a professional, but it's just, every once in a while you get that person that just insists. I'm like,
well, and and I've had people tell me, I want an employee handbook. And my first question, I'm a brand new business owner. And they're like, well, we have 12 employees. And I'm like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Go spend
the money elsewhere.
Yeah, spend your money elsewhere, put your energy in growing your business. And once you know you're a business and you're going to stay a business, then invest in those structural things such as an employee handbook.
Right. All right. Which makes perfect sense. That's fantastic. I mean, it's incredible how much actually goes into this and into all the other human resources policy creation and everything else.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say something else as well. When I work with my employers on creating their employee handbook, or more frequently updating an existing handbook, it's a long process because it gets us to touch on a lot of different work processes.
Right.
And work expectations. So they're not legal requirements, but they're really those management decisions. For one thing, the way we do business is evolving. So, some of the things that we were doing before are not relevant anymore. And so we shouldn't even mention it in the handbook. Another thing is businesses don't operate in a vacuum. My favorite example of that is around dress code, tattoos, piercing. 10, 15 years ago, again, the rules were very strict. People, no visible tattoos. If you had tattoos, you had to cover it with a sleeve or something.
Or makeup.
Then it became, no visible offensive tattoos, and limited piercing. Nowadays, it's like, everybody has tattoos, so you better get used to it.
Yeah. And
piercing, well, maybe you just don't put all your hooks and bells and whistles in all the holes you've got on your face every time you show up to work. But and that's because the society around us, what is considered norm, is changing, and so employers have to adapt. And sometimes, management tends to be older and more conservative. So sometimes I have to kind of have that sort of talk saying, I understand you don't like it personally, but would you be able to recruit if you had those very strict norms? And the other point is, does it really matter about how the work gets done?
Right. Right, as long as
Probably
it's not a
not.
safety issue, you have to be a little
Exactly.
flexible. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So anyway, those are the types of conversations that working on an employee handbook will generate, and I think it's healthy for management to kind of pause and ask themselves those types of questions.
all right. Well, yeah, that's fantastic information. And, you know, I mean, do you have anything else you would like to add to, before we kind of wrap this up? Like some takeaway, something that you think would just really be extra helpful, being besides all the amazing information you've already shared with us today.
I think the main thing is, if you know you're in a state that has a lot of legal requirements, talk to somebody who is knowledgeable, either an attorney or an experienced HR professional, and ask the questions. The other thing is attorneys. I like attorneys. They're really good people to work with, but attorneys do different things, and not every attorney actually understand employment law. So they might be a contracts attorney, which most businesses will use to write contracts and review contracts. Doesn't mean that person can actually provide you with a good employee handbook. So talk around, ask fellow business owners if they know of an employment law attorney who has reasonable prices. And also the other thing is ask for a fixed fee. So, I do my handbooks on a fixed fee basis, so that you know what you're committing yourself to. We have very specific criteria. And if they want more, then I'm like, hey, we're outside of the scope of what we contracted, you and I'm happy to do it, but this is what it's going to cost you, because small business have to, be very diligent about their cost. And I am a small business owner myself, so I understand that. And so, there is no shame in asking those types of questions.
Right. All right, so that was awesome. And so thank you very much, Anne-Lise. I really do appreciate you taking the time and explaining all of this. And, thank you all for watching and for joining us today. This has been another episode of the morning meeting. If you want to get a hold of Anne-Lise and bring her on, I highly recommend it. Absolutely. She is probably one of the most knowledgeable people I've met when it comes to human resources. And, not just employee handbook. She does a lot more than that. And believe me, she'd be an asset to working with you. All her contact information is down below, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to the replay on our podcast or catching it somewhere else on our blog. All the information on how to get a hold of her and and a whole bunch more very useful stuff, depending on where you're catching us, will be available down below. Thanks for joining us, and take care of each other.
All right. Thank you, Julio.
Bye.